Up next, we have our first panel of this summit. We've always had a number of panels when we're together in person that are audience favorites, and we wanted to maintain at least a few of those panels in a virtual platform. So really appreciate this panel coming together. We're going to be talking about some of the more innovative management strategies that GCDs have available in their Chapter 36 toolbox. And we have a great panel. I would like to introduce Drew Satterwhite. He's the general manager at the Red River and North Texas GCDs. He's going to moderate the panel. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Drew, to introduce your panelists at this point. Welcome, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Leah. We've got a great group of panelists here today. We're going to discuss some management strategies that are available to GCDs as groundwater management continues to evolve and become more complex with increased pressure on the resource. We're going to attempt to explore the what, why, and hows in the use of management zones, special conditions, phase permitting, moratoriums, as well as curtailment. As Julia mentioned earlier, you can find the detailed bios of all of these panelists in your live event program, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to provide a brief introduction to the panelists. We've got Troupe Brewer, who is a principal with the Lloyd Gosselink law firm. We've got Ty Edwards, who's the general manager of Middle Pecos GCD. And we have Mike Keester, who's a senior project manager and hydrogeologist for LRE Water. And with that, we're going to move into management zones. So if you'll cue the next slide. So a management zone is an area that's defined by a geographic and/or hydrogeologic boundary that has a set of rules that are unique to the rest of the district. And this enables the district to manage a set of circumstances that are not common in the rest of the district. So with that, Troupe, can you talk to us a little bit about what legal considerations might a district need to be aware of in establishing management zones?
Certainly. Thanks, Drew. Can y'all hear me okay?
Good deal. Can, yes.
Yeah, sure. So I've seen management zones employed across the state with many of our GCD clients and other folks, and they can be embodied in district's rules. They can be set by resolution. I've seen them embodied in management plans, but regardless of where you find them, the establishment of a zone should be pretty uniform, and it should be a thoroughly vetted process with stakeholder involvement and with appreciation and understanding of the concerns of those constituents of the districts that stand to be impacted, those folks within the boundaries of that zone to be proposed that either have permits or don't, but have property rights in groundwater. It should be absolutely a science-based decision, and as you'll hear throughout the day, kind of our mantra will be, science guiding policy, and that's certainly the case with the management zone. As the slide indicates, you could have a management zone for a number of reasons. If you've got a high concentration of wells, for example, and you're seeing some accelerated declines, a zone can be employed to provide enhanced monitoring and reporting within that zone, so the district has extra scrutiny on that production. It could be an area, for example, of seasonal production, high volumes for ag irrigation at certain parts of the year, and then a relatively low production amount in other times. Various reasons can support the designation of the zone, but it should always be couched again in the science that's available in a vetted process with stakeholder involvement and consideration from the district board to that degree.
All right, thanks, Troupe. So Mike, what technical considerations could affect the establishment of management zones?
Sure. So definitely when I'm thinking that the management area or zone, I tend to think of that, delineation primarily based on those hydrogeologic or kind of the aquifer conditions there. And I think we might be able to go to the next slide. But what I'm really going to be looking for is, where are conditions in one area significantly different than other areas of the aquifer within the GCD. That could be based on aquifer hydraulics. It could be based on water quality differences, structure of the aquifer, how the units are layered or faulting in there. It could be based on demand, where perhaps an area of greater demand than the aquifer, which certainly could affect some conditions. So really, those are the kind of those technical considerations that I'm going to be thinking about and looking at. Just wanted to kind of show a little example of where we looked at this as far as looking at some of those differences. In this particular example, really looked primarily at aquifer transmissivity. So where was the transmissivity of the aquifer different? And then how were the water levels in the aquifer different? Using those two values, we were able to calculate some differences in potential pumping rates within the aquifer, and then predict how far out a cone, where a well that was pumping, how far it might out that impact might go. And in this particular illustration, you can really see that in the eastern part of the county, there's a big difference. That cone of influence really only goes out about 100 feet, whereas in the western part, you see that that cone of influence, the aquifer hydraulics aren't quite as good, and that cone of influence, it goes out quite a bit further, up to a mile in some areas. So we can see quickly some very distinct hydrogeologic differences here that can really help to guide the delineation of an area or zone, and helps give that information to the board when they're deciding on a policy.
Good deal. Thanks, Mike. If you'll move on to the next slide, Ty, I understand your district has a few management zones, and wonder if you could touch on how these have worked and have they achieved their intended purposes.
Yes, thanks, Troupe. So for Pecos County, we're such a large district. We're just under 5,000 square miles. And in 2010, our board saw a need to be able to manage certain areas differently. Okay, the three areas that you see on the screen, or three management zones that you see on the screen, Management Zone 1 and Management Zone 2 are both producing out of the Edwards Trinity. But they're significantly different. In Management Zone 2, you have an influence of surface water from the Pecos River. You have a lot of other issues with brackish water upwelling into the Edwards that you have to consider in that area. In Management Zone 1, that most people are familiar with, has Fort Stockton Holdings or Clayton Williams Farms permits in. Copper Investments is involved. Management Zone 3 is a completely different aquifer. It's mainly out of the Pecos Valley aquifer, and also has surface water interaction as well. So we saw a need for those management zones early on after we were created, and have really spent a lot of time on science, specifically in Management Zone 1, where we have a large export permit for. So a few things that you really should consider when doing your management zone delineation is aquifer characteristics. I mean, Michael hit on it perfectly. The aquifer acts different in Pecos County in those management zones. Your pumping rates are different. The aquifer changes with recharge differently. So my board considered all those in 2010. That was one of the great things that we were able to do in managing our aquifer for Pecos County, was our delineation of Management Zone 1. And we can go to the next slide, which is a closer view of Management Zone 1. And you can see the pivot irrigation circles there. Those are the 18,000 plus acres of owned and leased property that Fort Stockton Holdings or Clayton Williams Farms has. And then the darker green area is a 5,000 plus acre pecan orchard that Copper Investments owns. And you can see that the zone is still fairly large, even compared to some districts. Comanche Springs, which is on the east side of the management zone, is 10 to 12 miles from the Belding area. So we're seeing groundwater declines and spring flow changes from a large area, from pumping from 10 to 12 miles away, which don't affect the other two management zones. So we've gone in and put 30 to 40 monitor wells in this area to really start learning the aquifer better in that area and how pumping affects it. We'll talk a little bit more about the thresholds and stuff and special permit conditions that we have for this area. But that's mainly what we've done for Pecos County.
All right, thanks, Ty. So with that, I guess we'll move into special conditions. Special conditions are permit conditions that go beyond the routine requirements of a permit issued by a district to deal with a circumstance that's unique to the permit at hand. So, Ty, right back to you. Why might a district want to consider including special conditions in a permit?
Right. So special permit conditions is a really good tool that groundwater districts have. when they're considering permits and they're in the application process or they're holding application hearings for drilling or production permits. The longer that groundwater districts go with permitting, the more that groundwater resources are going to be stressed. So the more hearings you're having, you're going to begin to have contested permitting, and you're going to start having your neighbors come in, and they're going to be more involved as you go along. And special permit conditions is one way that you can really help. Groundwater districts can help get the process down the road. You might have a general manager protesting the application. You might have several protestants protesting an application, and you might be able to alleviate a lot of those issues with monitor wells, with telemetry in those monitor wells, with collecting water quality measurements. Those are great things that groundwater districts can do to help, like I said, help resolve some of the issues that permittees have or protestants have with large permits. We've had several special permit conditions added to permits over the years. One of the main ones was for Fort Stockton Holdings. We actually added trigger levels in Management Zone 1 directly tied to their permits, where if aquifer conditions are met in certain wells, that their permit could be curtailed. And they've agreed to that, and it gives the groundwater district certainty. It made us feel more comfortable in approving the permit, and it gave the permittee some certainty in when they are and are not going to be able to pump. So I think special permit conditions can be used to really advance the ball, and we really shouldn't be messing with those too much over the next several legislative sessions. I think if you did away with special permit conditions, you'd probably be in the courthouse a lot more than you are now.
Yeah. And I know, Ty, like in our districts, we use special conditions for things that not necessarily contentious, but, to make our board, we have a lot of HOAs in our districts, and they like to irrigate large common areas. And so we'll throw in there, like usually if they're wanting to irrigate more than an acre, we'll throw in a special condition that requires them to have a smart irrigation controller and then to install one and maintain it throughout the life of the permit. And we use them for, like, our permits are perpetual in nature also. And so if we have like a commercial construction contractor that needs a well for 2 or 3 years to get through with the project, we'll put special conditions in there that require some type of action at the end of that period of need. And we'll put in there things such as, you need to plug the well as soon as you're done. You need to turn it into a monitoring well, let the district use it as a monitoring well, or seek a revised permit immediately upon the cessation of the construction period. And so that we use it for maybe a little more simple things, but that's how we use them. Troupe, what legal considerations should a district be aware of when crafting these special conditions?
Sure, and just to kind of reiterate the points made by yourself and Ty, these special permit conditions are great and useful tools that recognize kind of the inherent nuances and contextual differences that you'll see in a case-by-case permitting context, both within a district and then district to district. Talking about the differences for y'all's folks up north compared to Ty's folks out west, and the different conditions that y'all propose on your permittees for various reasons. But they're great tools, like Ty said, that can help in a decision in a grant of a permit with conditions versus a denial for whatever reason may be. And I agree entirely with Ty that they're great tools and mechanisms to keep folks out of the courthouse and reach resolutions, particularly in the contested case context. But and again, they can arise on the district staff level in the technical review process and working with district staff and consultants when issues or concerns arise. They can come from the board in the deliberative consideration of an application at a hearing. But most often you do see them in the contested case context, where they kind of serve as de facto provisions of a settlement that can be embodied then in the permit itself to address the concerns of for example, a landowner or a property owner with a domestic well who has a justiciable interest in their well and doesn't want to see their water level declines in their well for their domestic uses. So even in the context where you have a sophisticated applicant that has provided plenty of data and some modeling to demonstrate that over time, based on our proposed production, we don't believe we're going to see any unreasonable declines. you may still have a situation, particularly if there's several folks around with domestic wells, several protestants, they're going to want some assurances. And so the board can say, you know, great data, great modeling work. We appreciate all the due diligence you've done, applicant, but let's put a mechanism in place that's going to hold you to that. And a situation, a condition that'll say, if we do see water level declines that are trending towards unreasonable, let's bring folks back to the table and let's figure out what's going on. Let's put a mechanism in place to give those assurances. And so, you know, it's going to be most often a technical driven condition, a science-based condition. I mean, I've seen them, you know, conditions based on well completion, you know, conservation mechanisms, like you mentioned, Drew. A wide variety of different kinds of conditions can be used based on, you know, within a district in a given context, based on the variances of maybe a different aquifer compared to another aquifer within a district, or just based on the different uses that you're seeing. But the key is consistency. If you've got somebody that comes down in a particular area for a permit, there's concerns raised by the board. You know, if you've got somebody that comes in a month or a year later in that same area, you need to be discussing those same conditions, addressing those same concerns that have arisen if it comes from the board or from the district staff.
Yeah, thanks, Troupe. So Mike, what role might technical considerations play in crafting these special conditions?
Sure. So, you know, I think both Ty and Troupe have really hit on this, yourself as well, Drew, that thinking of some of these special conditions from a technical standpoint, I really look at them as a really a very good way to obtain data, to learn more about the aquifers that the district is working to manage, and to improve the understanding by the district and stakeholders of how these aquifers work, what the conditions in the aquifers are. So when I see, you know, some of the examples, for example, that are listed on the slide there, with requiring, for example, a measuring tube so that you can easily go out there as district staff to measure the well without worrying about getting hung up in the column pipe or something like that, or having some increased testing, potentially if you're in an area where water quality may be a little more potentially of an issue, making sure that there's a way that the district staff maybe can go out there and do some simple testing of the water quality in that area, or like I said, just reporting requirements. How much water are they using? So all of these can be some pretty simple special conditions you add in there to the permit to improve the understanding of the aquifers, and that are not necessarily too onerous on the property owner or on the well owner as well. So that's where I find these to be really useful.
All right, thanks, Mike. So we're going to talk about phase permitting next. This can fall under special conditions topic. A phase permit is a permit that allowable production adjusts over time. Typically, these phases will be triggered based on conditions such as aquifer levels or new permits. Ty, what might a district want to consider when talking about phase permitting?
Yeah, I think we need to go to a few more slides down as well.
There you go.
Right, so phase permitting is an approach that our GCD has considered several times in larger permit context. I know it's been done across the state. I think it'd be really important to use phase permitting, especially for wells, for large permits that haven't been drilled and haven't had any pump tests or geologic data collected. Specifically, having your monitor wells drilled, having your baseline levels done before your full permit is allocated and used. So I think that's a smart approach for these larger, typically these larger export permits. Having a phased approach is smart for GCDs, and it's smart for the applicant as well. You don't want to go full bore and then have several wells that you didn't anticipate to either dry up or be affected, and then you have a mess on your hands. So phase permitting is smart. It's a smart approach. It's a adaptive management approach and collecting data.
Yeah, and we both of our districts, we used phase permitting. They're both public water system heavy districts, and you know, it may not fit the innovative criteria that we're talking about here today, but you know, like when we get a new applicant, a new public water or an existing public water system says come in and drills a big well, and they may not need all the water that well can produce day one. It may satisfy their growth for 5, 10, 15 years. into the future. And so we'll use those. We'll look at Texas Water Development Board growth data. If they have an engineering master plan of their system, we'll consider those growth numbers, and we'll put in there in the special conditions. We'll phase their permit out. We won't give them all of the water they need 20 years from now. We may look at those and break it into like 5-year increments or something like that. And we have the opportunity to review those as those increments hit to make sure that we're on track, or if they're growing a little faster than they thought they were going to, then they have the opportunity to come in and prove to us why they need more quicker. So we use those to some extent also. Troupe, can you talk to us a little bit about how phase permitting is implemented from a regulatory perspective?
Sure. Yeah. And so most often in the phase permitting that I've seen, it's been embodied through special permit conditions. And typically, I've seen them involved in more of the higher production authorization permits that you'll see. And most often, I think you mentioned it, Drew, from a water supply standpoint, for long-term considerations for wholesale supply, municipal supply. With a long-term perspective, you come in on the front end and ask for a pretty high production authorization. But as Todd mentioned, you might not need it right now. You're anticipating growth over time for whatever reason. And so the district will spell out the phases within those permit conditions and address how and when an applicant can progress. What are the required demonstrations, most likely from a technical standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, from a policy standpoint, if it's a need demonstration, are going to warrant that applicant progressing to those phases. On the front end, you could get an authorization for 5,000 acre feet. You can set it, on a temporal basis, Drew. I think you mentioned a 5-year, 10-year timeline to say, okay, well, let's go at 5,000 for 10 years and let's see what kind of declines we're seeing. Does the model data support what we're seeing in real time over that time period? If so, let's check that box. Any other criteria that may apply, and let's move on. Let's increase to 10,000 acre feet. So that's kind of the process that you're going to want to outline with specificity in those permit conditions that embody your phases, so that the applicant and the district staff can work with the board to outline how and when these phases are met, the boxes are checked, and such that would warrant an applicant advancing to that next phase, that increased production authorization.
All right. Mike, how can and maybe even how should hydrogeology be incorporated into this phase permitting?
Should is a tough call there, but I'll go with the could. How could it be? Certainly, when we're taking a look at this, the information on a phase permit. We've approached it from the perspective of it gives the applicant, so the permittee, especially in the case of a public water supply, some of that certainty looking out 20, 30, 40 years into the future, understanding what their projected growth is as population under various population scenarios. And just like you had mentioned, Drew, there, with growth within the system, they need to have some certainty that they're going to be able to meet that demand in the future. So it gives them that certainty with the growth, and at the same time gives the GCD the ability to manage the resources, really look at how the aquifer is reacting to that production, how the conditions are changing, and then in particular, what are those aquifer conditions relative to the desired future conditions for the aquifer, so that if things are looking like it's going to be out of line with the DFCs, either, of course, there can be an adjustment to the DFC if that's possible, or some other potential steps taken that maybe that permit isn't able to grow like they anticipated. But it will still then allow that system the ability to look for alternative water sources well ahead of time and moving into the future. So I just wanted to kind of show this example here where we were looking at a water supply corporation that uses both surface water and groundwater. They were entirely on surface water, and then during that drought that was even spoken about during the previous presentation there, they had a problem where their intakes were no longer going to be able to access the surface water because just the lake level was getting too low. So they started looking at groundwater in order to meet those demands during those type of periods. And that's where they started looking at developing some groundwater and developing this phased permit that would grow with, it had some growth provisions in it to meet their projected demand, and those growth provisions would automatically kick in, correlating to DFC adoption. So it would give the district that opportunity to really look at the DFCs during that 5-year cycle. It gave the Water Supply Corporation some certainty that that water was, as long as they were meeting the DFCs, was going to be available to them at when they needed it. So it really worked out well from the technical perspective, being able to look at it from both sides.
All right, let's move into moratoriums here. So a moratorium is when a district suspends the granting of permits in order to buy time or gather more information to settle other issues which may affect future permitting decisions. So Troupe, would you get us kicked off here and talk about the legal considerations that we should be aware of when considering a moratorium?
Sure. So this is obviously a pretty significant action that, again, repeating the mantra of the day, is a policy decision that should be guided firmly in science. You're going to want to involve any affected stakeholders, any affected permittees or property owners that have rights in the groundwater and the aquifer of the formation that you're looking to impose a moratorium, and have them looped in from day one. And I could see these, being enacted typically by resolution. But again, as the slide states, it's to address a situation where there needs to be a temporary suspension of the granting of permits in a formation or an aquifer. And I could see it kind of falling on two sides. So it's either a situation where you might see there's high production and all of a sudden we're seeing some declines that are well beyond what's been modeled, what we've observed for years, a situation that the district wants to get out ahead of and say, hold on, let's pump the brakes. Let's put a pause on the issuance of permits. Let's dive into the science. Let's initiate stakeholder discussion with permittees and property owners, and take a hard look at the data to find out what's really going on here. And on the flip side, I could see it in a situation where, you might have a newly discovered formation or pocket that on the front end has a high productivity. You're getting 1,000 gallons a minute plus from a well that might be drilled, and it looks great. But maybe we don't have a model. Maybe we don't have a single other well or any monitoring data in this area, in this formation. And so from a due diligence standpoint, from a comfort level of the board to have that foundational science in place to base their permitting decisions moving forward, let's suspend permit issuance for a temporary amount of time. Let's develop that science. Let's get the data in place that will allow us, that will give us that comfort to make decisions moving forward on permit applications here.
All right, Troupe, I'm not going to let you off the hook yet. Would you talk a little bit about the recent legislation that's been proposed on this topic? I believe it was last session. Sure,
yeah, and I think it was the Chairman Larson, put a bill out there to kind of put a box around moratoriums, just to prescribe in paper how exactly they should be done. I think there was a time limit suggested as well, and then provisions for extension. But given the implications of a moratorium, the counsel we've given to clients and I'd recommend to all of our GCD brothers and sisters out there, have a notice and hearing aspect. You're gonna temporarily suspend permit issuance. That's an impact to landowners and property owners. Let's have justification for why we're doing this. Let's spell out at a hearing the science-based reasons that we're going to do this. And I think that was the general intent of the legislation from the chairman, to provide that opportunity for notice and hearing, to prescribe exact procedural requirements for implementing those moratoriums if that's the road you're going to go down. So even though the bill didn't pass, I think moving forward, any district that's going to explore this option would be wise to consider the language from that bill, particularly from the element of the notice and the hearing and involvement of stakeholders to really explain what's going on and to make sure all concerns and issues are vetted, both from the district's perspective and from the landowner perspective.
All right, thanks, Troupe. So Ty, I understand Middle Pecos has utilized the moratorium in the past. Can you explain that situation and whether or not you got what you needed to get done in that period of time?
Sure. So we have used the moratorium one time. We had an aquifer that was going to probably have some pretty large permits coming in. At the same parallel track, we had TWDB releasing their MAG reports and their models. We did put a moratorium in place for the Capitan Reef aquifer for no production permits, and it lasted about 12 months. You could do a drilling permit application. You could drill a monitor well. It just put a hold on new production permits until TWDB released their models and their GAMs. So we would have the science in place to evaluate some of these applications that were to come in. Now, really, the only thing I would add that Troupe didn't, and Drew and Michael haven't touched on, is just make sure If your GCD is doing a good job, you're not surprising any of your permittees or your applicants with the decisions you're making. You're holding your meetings, you're discussing these moratoriums multiple times. If you're doing a really good job, you have most of your constituents on board with what you're doing. So it's not a surprise. You don't have a knee-jerk reaction and have something happen where you take such a large either legislative or local political hit by doing the moratorium. Now, I will say that since we did do the moratorium, we did have a legislative committee meeting in Fort Stockton where we had to face up to Lyle Larson to what we did. So that could happen. You know, if you put a moratorium in place, just know that it's going to be discussed statewide. We need to be making the right decisions, and we did, and the moratorium's been lifted, and we have our science in place to move along with our business. So I would say yes, the moratorium did what we wanted it to do. We were able to get the science in place. We've recently drilled, the city of Fort Stockton has recently drilled a Capitan Reef monitor well, and we're collecting more data every day on that aquifer.
Yeah, fortunately, I have no experience with moratoriums yet, but I imagine you're right there, Ty, that communication is key in that process. Mike, do you have anything to add as far as technical considerations on a moratorium?
Well, I think both Troupe and Ty and yourself, you really hit on it. That, you know, this, when they start talking about moratoriums, those really are, in my opinion, a very much a policy decision. But it would be my job as a hydrogeologist to communicate clearly to the board and the district staff what those hydrogeologic conditions are of the aquifer, what we know, or like Ty mentioned, what we don't know. And in the case of, you know, if there's something that we just really don't know the information in order to move forward to give good permitting advice to the board, you know, a clear communication of how long it might take to develop that information. So from the technical side, I think that we can provide that good information on the hydrogeologic conditions, but the moratorium itself, really, I feel like that's more of a policy decision.
All right, thanks, Mike. So as y'all notice, our topics get more contentious as we move through our agenda here. The next up is curtailment. Curtailment is when a district reduces groundwater production through permits and rules based on certain triggers being met, such as water levels, spring flows, etc. So we're going to turn it over to Ty. Why should a district have rules regarding curtailment of pumping?
Right, so curtailment's obviously a contentious issue, but I think if you had, and I don't know if I would call it exactly curtailment, but that's what it is. But if you have thresholds set for your aquifer and everybody's on the same page that when these levels are met, your pumping is reduced. And if you can get buy-in for that, then there's certainty. There's certainty for the permittee, there's certainty for the groundwater district that we're going to make sure groundwater in our aquifers are protected. Instead of just leaving that up in the air in your rules, it's something that we all should be considering, especially if you have the data and the science in place and you have a real good understanding of what you're working with. I know curtailment could sounds bad, and it could be bad if you're having wells drying up, but it could be a good thing as well as far as having certainty.
Okay, Troupe, what legal and/or regulatory considerations should districts be aware of when proposing and adopting curtailment rules?
Sure, and just echoing right on what Ty said, you know, it's certainly a scary word, but I think it embodies several different situations and considerations. You know, you can have within your district's rules provisions for curtailment on a district-wide or aquifer-wide basis. You can have them built into special permit conditions. You know, you see them in the context of achieving DFCs and addressing drought conditions in your management plan. So there's various settings that you can see, you know, provisions that you could put under the umbrella of quote unquote curtailment. But again, you know, Ty nailed it. If you are in a situation where you've got curtailment provisions, reduction in authorization based on thresholds of decline, and they're agreed to and vetted through a permitting process and special conditions, that provides certainty, and that's great for both the permittees and the folks that were involved and for the district. You know, if a district ever does go down that road outside of an individual, special permit condition context, if it's more of a district-wide or aquifer-wide action, again, firmly based in observed data and science, and if it's going to be an aquifer-wide or a district-wide curtailment, we might not be in a good situation. We're obviously seeing something district-wide that is giving us concern and is warranting an action that rises to a level of across the board curtailment. And it would be applied evenly. I would recommend across maybe classes of permits, operating permits, all within, if it's a specific aquifer that's experiencing significant decline, an equal pro rata reduction to every operating permit holder within that formation. And then if that's not enough to address the issue, if we're still seeing declines moving forward, a reduction in the historic and existing permits or the grandfather permits for those folks that have that heightened protection, could be applied so long as it's done uniformly pro rata across that class. And again, it's going to be something that is a significant action of the board that needs to be open and transparent, full stakeholder involvement, and working with folks like Mike and maybe district technical staff to explain what we're doing and why, with the hope that we see some rebound, that we can lift these curtailments over time. But that's certainly the ultimate goal, that long-term management horizon that the districts should always be operating under.
All right, Mike, talk to us about the technical considerations that should be considered when proposing and adopting curtailment rules.
So some of those technical considerations that I think about are, I'm looking at, or I tend to think about the idea of curtailment with regard to what are the measured aquifer conditions relative to the adopted desired future conditions. So how's the aquifer actually, we're measuring it, what's it looking like? In an area, for example, with average drawdown as the DFC, how are those drawdowns looking? How is the difference from the baseline looking at this time? And being able to clearly identify as the district, my job is going to be to really help the district staff and help the district board be able to communicate with stakeholders about where are we monitoring these water levels, where are we monitoring these changes, or where are we monitoring spring flow, for example. What are the levels, as Troupe and Ty both mentioned about the kind of those levels, those potential curtailment levels. How do we communicate those with the stakeholders? And that can sometimes be the real challenge there, to make something that can be potentially complicated into something that's pretty easy to understand and to visualize. So being able to communicate those metrics to the stakeholders becomes really important. And our job really as the technical consultant is going to be to help the board do that and help the district staff do that. A lot of times what we may see also, though, is in the example here, is that we may need to make some type of adjustment in order to show stakeholders, well, yeah, we have this measured data. How does that correspond to these desired future conditions that we've adopted based on some modeling? How do those two correlate? Do they look the same, or do they match well? Well, sometimes we might have to make some adjustments and be able to communicate that information as well. So all of this information is really, it comes down to, on the technical side, yeah, we can certainly show you some hydrographs, we can show you some spring flow measurements, but being able to take that information, condense it down into something that's easily digestible for the district staff, district board, and the district stakeholders is going to be really important before you even go down that road of applying some curtailment rules.
All right. Any of you guys have any further thoughts on curtailment before we move on?
Well, I would just mention one last thing to just touch on what Michael said. You have to make sure you have your monitoring in place. You have to make sure your production's being reported properly. Those are important factors before you can just go start curtailing. You have to have all those things in place and have a good understanding of what you have going on.
All right, thanks, Todd. Leah, it looks like we're still right on time. Is that correct?
You are in great shape. Yeah, so if you guys want to take a few minutes, we're closing thoughts, and then we do have a number of great questions that have come in.
Let's start with Mike. You have any closing thoughts, Mike?
Sure. So as a technical consultant, my job really is to be there to support folks like you, Ty, to provide you that as clear an understanding of the hydrogeologic conditions, of what's going on with those aquifers within the district, and being able to provide you that information in a clear, concise method. So I think the real innovation from, in my opinion, it really comes from that collaboration between folks like myself, technical experts, and then folks like Troupe and Ty and the boards that are Drew, the policy experts with the GCDs.
All right, thanks, Mike. Troupe?
Sure. So, each of these tools that we've discussed, kind of recognize the inherent challenges that our GCDs have when facing, unique, local case-by-case considerations that arise in a permitting context or otherwise. These situations require flexibility from a management standpoint, and the district needs to have the ability to meet these unique challenges. So all these tools that we discussed are ways to do that. And so I think the legislature in drafting Chapter 36 recognized this need for flexibility and has provided our districts with the adequate tools and regulatory mechanisms to address the challenges that we have in order to accomplish our constitutional and statutory duties to conserve, manage, and protect private property rights and groundwater. As we counsel all of our GCD clients, informed decision-making is fundamental. Rely on your staff, rely on your consultants in developing the best available science, and use that science as the foundation for your decisions, for the policy that you make. Recognize the situations where you have enough science to justify a decision and to feel comfortable in doing that, but also recognize the situations where you may not, and employ the mechanisms that we've discussed to address that lack of data or that lack of science. Engage with your stakeholders, be open and transparent, and again, lean heavy on the science, and you'll be all right.
All right, thanks, Troupe. Ty, you have any closing thoughts?
Right, so I just ditto or echo what they said. Adaptive management is really what we're talking about, and we need to let data drive those decisions. Okay, models are good, and we use models all the time in our processes with groundwater management, but data really needs to be the key thing here. Data. We need to be collecting data. As general manager, we manage a lot of things. We manage the public, we manage your utilities and all of your cities in the area, and having those, being able to meet with those people and being on the same page with all of your people in your county that you're representing and you're working with. So for the groundwater district managers listening to me, get out of your office, go with your field tech, collect data, go see your stakeholders, get out and see your counties.
All right, thanks, guys. Leah, you said we have some questions?
We do, and I will just remind folks that we're taking questions from the audience through the questions feature on GoToWebinar. It's probably in the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. Partway down, it should say questions, and you should be able to open it up and submit questions. So I'm going to take these the order they came in, which kind of goes through the outline of your discussion. Ty, this one was for you. What boundary lines did you use in establishing your management zones? Did those follow property lines? And I think the issue there is splitting up a landowner's property half in, half out.
No, we didn't consider property lines. We considered science. So it was data driven. Specifically, management zone 1 was based off of a percentage that we saw that impacted spring flow. But no, it didn't consider property lines.
How did landowners feel about that? I wonder, I mean, were they on board and understood why that property was being managed differently because of the scientific considerations of the management zone?
Sure. Well, first thing, outside of those management zones, there's really not any large production. And so we really wanted to focus on the areas that have the large production of groundwater, which is inside those management zones. And then 2, the management zones can be changed. If you have a line that goes through one landowner and they have a proposed project just on the other side of the line, we're probably going to go through a process to include you into the management zone. And same thing, adaptive management. We did it off the best available data we had at the time. If you have something different, we'll consider it and change it.
Great. Another question came in, and it was about the special conditions. And the question was, kind of at what point do special conditions become not so special anymore? Are they becoming standard and perhaps should be incorporated into a district's rules rather than put on as special conditions? And maybe Troupe, you're the best one to start with that.
I'll certainly agree that we're seeing a proliferation of the use of special conditions throughout the district, or throughout the districts in the state. I guess that's a policy decision for a district board if they want to enact certain rules. A big picture policy decision if the legislature wants to take action to implement certain commonly seen special permit conditions into Chapter 36. But at the end of the day, special conditions provide that flexibility that might not otherwise exist in the rules to address really site specific or really local concern, and that can help a district solve problems. So on the one hand, I certainly see and understand why you'd want to include the more common special conditions on a more wide scale if it makes sense. But then again, you don't want to hamstring yourself to have to apply that in every context where it may not make sense.
Mm-hmm. Ty or Mike, did you have anything to add on that one?
I think that certainly, like you said, there are some special conditions that show up pretty frequently. And that in some cases, those may be just the case that it's a special condition until the district has come around to doing a rules revision. So certainly that could be the case as well, in which case that special condition gets put in as something that's done on all wells with the option to have an exemption. Because certainly not all wells throughout the district are going to be the same. So, that may be a case where an exemption is a type of special condition.
Right. Chapter 36 does a good job of allowing us to be able to change, to be able to adapt to whatever is coming at us and try to make the best decision that we can to protect our resources and follow the law. So, I mean, yes, at some point, your special conditions probably could be rules, but you're going to come up with other situations and different applications that you might need to do something else.
Mm-hmm.
That special condition I talked about earlier, the smart irrigation controllers, we actually started implementing that in special conditions for about a year and a half. And then ultimately, just within the last few months, we've actually adopted those into the rules to that question. This is just something we need to do. If you have an acre or more that you're trying to irrigate, you need to, it's not part of the negotiation, it's part of the rules from that point. So.
Great. So the next couple questions deal with the phased permitting conversation that y'all had. The first was, have any of you dealt with a situation where you couldn't allow the permittee who had a phased permit to advance to the next phase? Mike, maybe we'll start with you.
The example that I gave is really the only one that I've worked with at this point, and it has not come to a point where it was recent enough that issue has not come up yet.
Right. So the only thing I would add on that is that maybe it hasn't happened, but if the data points to not needing or not wanting or not allowing to go to the second phase, and then that needs to happen. If the data shows that everything's good, you move on. Just clearly have that in your phase permitting approach.
Troupe, did you have anything to add on that one?
I have not had an experience with a client on either side, an applicant or a GCD, where we've had an issue with phase advancement.
Yeah, I would say that actually, though, within that one phase permit, that the example that I did give, it is very clear in the permit that if the DFCs are not being achieved, it doesn't move on. So it's clear in the permit language.
Yeah, which maybe is something to really think about carefully, is having that laid out exactly what is going to happen, and not have it be too flexible, having too much adaptability into the permit so that that there's not argument there. Okay, and then one other question that came in on phase permits was that what specific factors should the GCD address within the special conditions in order to handle negative impacts that could arise later? Things like negative impacts to surface water, other well owners, water quality. Troupe, do you want to maybe start on that one?
Yeah, and again, that's in the context of phasing or just special conditions in general?
It was posed in the context of phasing, yeah.
Sure. So all adequate concerns and considerations, and I would certainly want those spelled out specifically within those conditions, within the phases, to say what impacts of surface water would warrant prohibiting that permittee from advancing. So I think, those concerns can certainly be addressed, and that's part of the purpose, I think, of those phase conditions, to say, beyond the long-term planning and the need increase over time, concerned about impacts, whether it's the surface water or groundwater or other existing users and permittees, what barriers are going to be spelled out on the front end in permit issuance that say, yeah, you know what, we're not going forward with this next phase because we've seen those demonstrated impacts. But those impacts, whatever they may be, need to be specifically spelled out, both for folks that are impacted and especially for the permittee, to have that certainty and to have that understanding that, yep, look, we're looking at the data real time now, 10 years, whatever down the road. It's showing that we can advance, and that's clearly spelled out, and then there's no issue there.
Mike, anything to add on that one?
I think Troupe hit on it well there, that, those are all items that can be addressed. Certainly not every well is going to be in a hydrogeologic situation. This conditions aren't going to be the same where all of those items need to be addressed necessarily, but it would be up to the GCD to certainly determine which of those other conditions should be addressed. And in which case, I think you would certainly be looking at the ultimate, the end of what that final permit amount is going to be and what those impacts would be under that final permit amount. You go, okay, are those going to be exceeded?
Great. And actually another one on phase permits, that definitely a topic a lot of people are interested in. How do districts set policy regarding the time frame that should be used when you're looking at a phased permit? Should it be 10, 30, 50, 100-year demand projections? Ty, do you want to weigh in on that one?
I think it'd probably go off of the testimony in the hearing.
Troupe?
I think it's case by case. How big of a volume are we talking about? What's the use? What factors would be built into this phasing that would warrant including this temporal element to the phase permitting? You can have it two ways. It could be a phase based on time alone, or it can be phasing based disconnected from time, but just satisfying other certain established criteria. I would comment that you're going to want to look at the applicable district's permit renewal timelines. I think that's an element that ties into time, obviously, for phasing. So in consideration of when permits are up for renewal, the long-term use and the long-term need of the applicant, I think all those factors could be built into phasing and would be considered when putting a time nature into this phasing criteria.
I really felt like we worked with the district on that particular permit, and we worked back and forth collaboratively with them to try to figure out just to answer the question you just asked, really, what would be the really good opportunity for looking at potentially going for that next growth in the permit. And in those discussions, it was the district suggested that, yeah, it probably would be a really good idea to look at this when we have DFCs in the forefront of our mind there. So looking at the joint planning cycle, and when it comes around time to adopt new DFCs, and those have to go through some, the hearings at the district as well, that 5-year cycle just really fit well for consideration of these growth provisions in this type of permit as well. So I think that's just something to consider as well, as just, when you have those DFCs forefront in your mind, also look at, well, can we actually let these permit amounts grow to the next phases?
Wonderful. One last quick question came in. I think this one shouldn't take too long to answer. Troupe, it's probably best for you to take. Are there legal restrictions as to the size of management zones?
I don't think there's legal restrictions to the size, the boundaries of the zone itself. I think you may have an issue if you're looking at a zone and the science supports it that you'd want to cross over into another district. Perhaps there's some kind of MOU and a memorandum of understanding that could be entered into between the two districts to make sure that that zone is appropriately sized, that it doesn't end at the district boundaries if the science warrants that it doesn't. And the district could have a collaborative approach with their neighbor in managing that zone. That's the only legal consideration, just particularly to boundaries and to size that I would think of. I mean, the property line consideration, is an issue, but as Ty mentioned, there's ways ways to address it. You set the boundaries where the science warrants they be set. If you've got a property owner that wants to be included, there's an amendment process to that zone where you can expand the boundaries as needed to loop in, the entirety of a property, for example.
Wonderful. Well, that is our time for this panel. This was great. I've actually been getting texts on my phone about how interesting this has been, you guys. So I think kudos to you all. Appreciate you being our guinea pigs today, the first panel we've done virtually. You guys did a great job. Really interesting conversation. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
Leah.
Thank y'all, guys.
Gentlemen, thank y'all. Leah, thank you.